10 days ago, the New York Times had articles saying that there were demonstrations in 3 cities. Now, there are demonstrations in almost every city in this nation, almost every day now. Some of them bigger, some of them littler, but people are getting out on the streets and moving. And the fact that the New York Times would notice it, I mean, they said it was like there were the first 3 demonstrations. It was just that they bothered, the fact that they would bother to mention it, to have an article about it, to have photographs of people demonstrating. This clearly is an indication that for some reason they're turning a little bit. And that reason may be because of the disastrous, blundering performance of Ronald Reagan in Iceland, and it may be because at the outset of his Nicaraguan war, moving from phase 1 to phase 2, he was caught out in illegal activities. And we can talk about all of these things later on. When you get to the point, you recall, the Vietnam War was shut down. When we got to the point in a society where the Walter Cronkites and the media began to acknowledge the mistake, the lies, and turn on the administration and force them, put pressure on them. What we're going to talk about tonight is Nicaragua. It's about Central America. It's about the secret wars of the CIA, but it's about a lot more things than that. To say the obvious, we live in a beautiful country, perhaps in some ways the most prosperous, richest, beautiful country. We're all aware of that. I've fought in 3 wars defending this country and the freedoms that we brag about and all. And just look at this building. And what we're going to talk about tonight, though, is not that, and it's also not altogether, it's only indirectly about the good people in the United States, and there's lots and lots of good people. Unfortunately, it's in human nature to balance out the good with evil. And in this country, for all of the good things we are, have, and do, we seem determined, one way or another, to keep something going that just about balances out all of the good with something that it's difficult to find a better word for than evil, if you'll forgive me. Everything I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is in the public record already. You don't need me to come here and put it together for you. This information in one night, it's devastating to a lot of people. Old-time activists go away a little bit shocked, but what they know, but just having it all put together at one time, and people who are just getting into activity and awareness have trouble shifting gears and adjusting. I try to document it as best I can as I go. I have a bibliography. You can go and read for yourselves. I urge you to do so. I'm going to be telling you that our government lies a lot about very important things. Now, obviously, if I'm saying that Mr. Reagan lies, I could be the one that's lying. And the only way people can figure out the truth or have any chance of figuring out the truth is to get involved. Go and read for yourselves. And this is very important. The French have a saying, them that don't do politics will be done. If you don't go out and get yourselves involved, then you've got no right to complain when Mr. Reagan grabs you or your son or your loved one and sends him down to Nicaragua to kill people or to be killed. And you don't have any right to complain really when the bombs start going off. If you haven't gotten involved now, well, there's still time to do something about it. What we're talking about overall is the fact that we live in a world that has grievous problems. As Helen Caldecott likes to put it, our planet is terminally ill. The disease is the nuclear arms race, and it's not a long-term disease. What we're talking about is the 52,000, soon to be 70,000 nuclear weapons that malfunction all the time and are in the control of visibly fallible, angry human beings. The world we live in today has the kind of economic problems that have gotten us into world wars in the past. Leaders of countries, leaders of banks have never been able to balance their checkbooks. Just like families, they screw it up all the time. They have throughout history, and they've done it again. Only this time, the opportunity of resolving the thing by having a war that reduces, capitals of countries and countries themselves to rubble so you can start over again isn't available to us because of these 52,000, soon to be 70,000 nuclear weapons. What I'm talking about is a world in which the world's richest country, the United States, is now a significant debtor nation. In the last 6 years, our internal debt has gone from $900 billion to $2.4 trillion. And we've become an external debtor nation for the first time since World War I. And that's on that side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, we have the third world debt, which is so large that the interest payments are $40 billion a year. And the countries can't meet those payments. So they have to get loans to pay the interest on the loans, which means they're double compounding the problem, which means that in 10 years, their interest payments will be $400 billion a year. And they won't be able to get loans to cover those payments. And when they default, banks are going to start collapsing, like Chase Manhattan, the big ones. This is the third world debt time bomb. The Center for Defense Information is counting about 40 or 50 wars being fought around the world today. Caspar Weinberger says 1 out of 4 nations is fighting wars. And there's deep concern that the United States is on the brink of its next war, the Central American War. Meanwhile, the United States has established an open policy of supporting low-intensity conflicts about the globe. The CIA, primarily backed up by the Defense Department and very much by the administration, is running 6 major covert actions. Senate Oversight Committee people tell us in their debates, they leak it out, that the CIA is running 50 covert actions. Covert actions interfere with and destabilize other countries' governments. This means, simply put, that we have a policy of destabilizing about 1/3 of the countries in the world today. And these subjects all interrelate. The nuclear arms race, conventional war, CIA destabilization, they're all supervised in Washington by the National Security Council. And the rationales and direction and thrust of energy in these things all interrelate. And that's what I hope to be able to show you tonight, is how these problems, how Nicaragua relates to the nuclear arms race. I begin with my own specialty, which was paramilitary, Marine Corps, CIA, little wars, secret wars, 3 wars. I was in the Congo dealing with CIA mercenaries. I was up country in Vietnam. In the Angolan operation in 1975, I was the chief, the coordinator, chief of the Angola Task Force in Washington, sitting on a subcommittee of the National Security Council, managing the war that was delivering arms loads, airplane loads of arms and mercenaries into Angola. Another lecture, another time, we can go into the rationales, because we didn't feel like we were in the process of anything pathological. Our rationales to ourselves was that it was patriotic and noble and defending national security and all of these things. When the rationales no longer worked for me, I got out. But that, as I say, is a different story. Nicaragua, of the 6 covert actions that we're running around the world, destabilizations, Nicaragua is the most prominent one. It's not the largest one, at least not until very recently. Afghanistan probably was. We were spending hundreds of millions of dollars in Afghanistan. Now in Nicaragua, it's the most conspicuous one. It's closer to the United States, closer culturally. Over 100,000 Americans have gone down to look and see for themselves. The debate is fairly open. We know a lot about it. I've taken myself down there 8 times, including just a month ago, because I lecture on the subject, to analyze the covert action from the other side, as opposed to being in Washington as I was for the Angolan operation, where our rationales were stopping the Cubans and stopping the Russians, and standing up to the enemies in the world and all of that. Quite a different thing when you go down and talk to the commandantes who are coping with the thing, talk to the people, go out and pick cotton with the people, talk to women who've been gang raped by men trained in Florida, and put your hands on the nubs of missing limbs of maimed children. Quite a different view than the one I had when I was sitting in my offices in Washington. The thing we're doing in Nicaragua today used to be called covert action. Not so covert really anymore, although it's still run by the CIA. It's a technique of destabilization. Let there be no doubt, this is not my semantics. That's what CIA directors call it. The State Department's stated purpose is that we're hitting economic targets. Mr. Reagan says the purpose is to stress out the Sandinistas, to put pressure on them, to bring them to our will so they'll knock off their policies. What you're doing is you have a selected target government, and it's quite whimsical. We'll target somebody, attack them for a while, give up on it, go attack someone else. We attacked China for a bunch of years, and then in 1984, Mr. Reagan went there on a big showy trip to bolster his chances for re-election. What you set out to do to put pressure on this targeted government is methodically rip apart the social and economic fabric of the country, sort of the opposite of nation building. It's doing your best to destroy the nation so that when conditions get so bad, you can walk in and install the government of your choice, or at least force that government that's there to come to your terms. It's worked both ways. It's been done before by the United States. You're setting out methodically to create conditions where the farmer can't get his produce to market, where children can't go to school, where women are terrified inside their homes and outside their homes, where the hospitals are treating wounded people instead of sick people, where government administration grinds to a halt, where international capital is scared away, and the country literally goes bankrupt. In Nicaragua, this program, this United States government program, began officially in 1981 in December when Mr. Reagan allocated the first $19 million to the CIA to destabilize Nicaragua. If you want to get a feeling for what it's all about, the Contras, under this program we took these people who were Somoza's ex-guardsmen, not a nice bunch of people, corrupt and brutal, and we put them in Honduras. We put uniforms on their backs and boots on their feet and guns in their hands, and we fed them and trained them and gave them leaders and delivered them into Nicaragua to destabilize, and we flew in support for them, and we've continued to support them. Read the Newsweek article November 7, 1982, lamenting the fact we're getting involved once again in a third world morass. It said the people we're supporting, the Contras, we're getting involved with. It described them as the only truly evil, totally unacceptable factor in the Nicaraguan equation. It noted they had no chance of taking power in Managua. So it asked, why were we doing it? And it answered its own question by saying that the purpose was to push the Sandinista government into a more radical position from which we could attack it more openly. So we set out with this force systematically now for 5 years. They've been blowing up granaries, sawmills, bridges, government offices, schools, health centers. They mine roads, they ambush trucks, they raid farms and villages. There's all kinds of documentation on this, witnesses on the scene. The sabotage manual, if you remember the sabotage manual, 1983, a CI comic book with pictures suggesting all the nice things you can do to gum up typewriters, to burn out the transmissions in trucks, to stop up sewers, to blow transmissions, to make a society so it just won't work. Assassination is part of this program. Assassination of religious workers, teachers, health workers, elected officials, government administrators. And this one too is documented. In 1984, the assassination manual that the CIA was using to train, it had translated into Spanish from Vietnamese, became such a political issue that Mr. Reagan himself addressed it in his debates with Walter Mondale in the presidential campaign, and he himself ascribed the blame to the CIA station chief in Tegucigalpa. Part of this program down there is terror that goes far beyond the hideous things that are done by certain parties in the Mediterranean area today that we lament so much. I don't mean to come here and abuse you with a form of verbal violence, but this is what your country is all about. Our Contras go into villages, they haul people out at night, they make the children watch while they castrate the father and peel the skin off his face and put a grenade in his mouth and pull the pin. They make the children watch while they gang rape the mother and slash her breasts off. And sometimes, for variety, they switch it around and make the parents watch while they do these things to the children. Now, this is nobody's propaganda. 4,000 people have been killed this way about. Figure published in the New York Times recently said 5,000, mostly women and children. It's been documented and condemned by over 100,000 American witnesses for peace, by the Presbyterian Church, by the World Court, by the Methodist Church, by broad segments of the Catholic Church. Mr. Reagan, however, whatever makes this man tick, he remains unapologetic. He says, I'm a Contra. He calls them freedom fighters. He likens them to the moral equivalent of his founding fathers. And the whole world gasped at this confession of his family traditions. Read for yourselves. The documentation is abundant. Read Contra Terror by Reed Brody, the former Assistant Attorney General of New York State. Read The Contras by Dieter Ike. Read With the Contras by Christopher Dickey. Dickey's a middle-of-the-road journalist working for the Washington Post in Central America. Now he's in Egypt with Newsweek. Middle of the road, in his book With the Contras, his first acknowledgement is to express his deep respect for the men and women of the CIA. So he writes a book that's a pox on both your houses. He doesn't like the Sandinistas. But he went on patrol with the Contras. Read what he has to say about them. Read Witness for Peace, what we've seen and heard. Read the Lawyers' Commission on Human Rights. Read Violations of War on Both Sides. Read the Mesquite Indians in Nicaragua. Or, as some of you have done, go to Nicaragua and see for yourselves. Propaganda is part of any destabilization. The battle for people's minds. The big target is the American people, turning them against your targeted country. This one began under Jimmy Carter, before Mr. Reagan was president. The CIA presented a proposal to the White House, which was approved by Jimmy Carter, that they launch a propaganda campaign to paint the Sandinistas evil. Now, we'll never know what the Sandinistas would have done with that country if we had left them alone to do it, to make their mistakes or whatever. We do know that they abolished the death sentence. We do know that they released 8,000 guardsmen that they had in their custody because they said, we won't jail someone because he belonged to an organization. We have to have evidence of individual crimes. We do know that they launched a broad literacy campaign, teaching every Nicaraguan to read and write, something that Somoza and the United States had not gotten around to doing. And that they built 2,500 clinics trying to get some kind of health service to every Nicaraguan. And that they took as much of the land as they could without nationalizing. They took the 50% of the land that belonged to Somoza, and they began a land reform program that far exceeds anything that's been attempted in Central America ever. They also succeeded in the first 4 years in office in establishing the largest economic growth rate of any Latin American country. A phenomenal record. Not true anymore because our destabilization has dragged them down. We, instead of going in and helping them build clinics and teaching people to read and write, we label them totalitarian dictators. We claim that they're building a war machine that threatens the stability of all of Central America. Now, they're building an army. The world's richest country is attacking them, one of the world's poorest countries, attacking them in a war that to date is statistically, economically, more important to them than the Vietnam War was to us, with the difference that we fought the Vietnam War 10,000 miles away, and this war is being fought with the horrors inside their own territory. But we say they don't have the right to build up a force to defend themselves. We claim the justification is that they are flowing arms into the rebels in El Salvador. But Mr. Reagan, the State Department, in 5 years has not been able to show any flow of arms. Meanwhile, David McMichaels, the CIA analyst, goes public and tells us that there was no information inside the CIA of any flow of arms since 1981. And Charlie Clements goes in and lives with those rebels in El Salvador for a year, and he comes out and says they're not using communist weapons, they're using U.S. weapons, which they get from the El Salvadorian army. We launched a campaign to discredit their elections. We said it's a totalitarian country, they have elections that are phony and rigged. But the international observer teams said these were the fairest elections they've observed in Central America in a long, long time. Meanwhile, we say the elections in El Salvador were models to be copied elsewhere in the world. But then the truth about that comes out, didn't it? That great pinko in Washington, Senator Jesse Helms, told us the truth about that one. He was ticked off because the CIA had chosen to support Duarte instead of his choice of candidates, Roberto D'Aubuisson, otherwise known as Blowtorch Bob, for the games he likes to play at night on people's feet. So Jesse Helms used his influence through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to get himself briefed, and then he held a press conference, and he said the CIA told him they had spent $2.2 million and done everything but, quote, stuff the ballot boxes to make sure that Duarte won. And our government's claiming that's a model to be copied elsewhere in the world. President Reagan himself and the State Department and CIA propaganda claiming that the Sandinistas are financing their revolution by smuggling drugs into the United States. Now, when I first heard this thing a couple of years ago, I snorted and said, it doesn't make sense. We're at war with Nicaragua. We're trying to catch them out getting arms from the Soviet Union and Cuba. We're flying planes wingtip to wingtip over Nicaragua, photographing everything that comes and goes. How are they going to flow plane loads of drugs into the United States? But there are other Nicaraguans flying on planes every day of the week and to bases in the United States, in Florida, Louisiana, and Texas, where they don't have to go through customs. These are Nicaraguan Contras working under the supervision of the CIA. Now, would I come before you and suggest that the CIA might ever be involved in smuggling drugs? Heaven forbid. Read for yourselves. Read the book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Al McCoy, 1972. 300 references in his bibliography to every chapter, documenting what he wrote. The United States took over from the French in Southeast Asia when they were whipped at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French intelligence officers were, in fact, Corsican mafia, smuggling the heroin from Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia. And the CIA took over from them. The French had their own airline. The CIA introduced its Air America, which at that time was the world's largest airline, by the way. CIA proprietary airline, flying in arms to the Mayo, the Hmong, the Montagnard people, flying back out with loads of heroin to Hong Kong, Bangkok, and Saigon, the first target being the U.S. GIs, in Vietnam the second market being the United States itself. We claim the Sandinistas are responsible for the terrorism that exists in Central America today. Even when there's a bombing in Berlin, George Shultz will go on television and refer to the country club of terrorists in Managua. There's terrorism in Central America for sure, and it is not being done by the Sandinistas. It's being done by the United States of America, and the terrorism is far, far more hideous than spraying an airport with bullets or shooting an old man in the head and pushing him off a ship. We're talking about mutilation and gang rape and mutilation of children as a matter of policy. And we blame the Sandinistas for misery. And there is misery in Nicaragua today and shortages. And it's clearly not the Sandinistas' fault. That was the purpose of our program. Congressmen now can go down there after 5 years and come back, and they're doing it on fact-finding trips. I was there. You should see the place. It's the pits. The socialism doesn't work. These Sandinistas can't run a country. It's the worst place I've ever been to. They have shortages you wouldn't believe. And Mr. Reagan could turn the contra-aid vote this summer by saying there are Russians flying planes for the first time in this hemisphere in history, and we have to do something about it. And I refer you to the November 7, 1982 Newsweek article. What was the purpose of doing this? The purpose was to push the Sandinistas into a more radical position from which they could be attacked more openly. So this summer, the Congress passed the contra-aid bill, $100 million, but that's only the cover. If you've been reading the record coming out of Congress, the LA Times, Newsweek magazine, others reporting, the CIA has allocated $400 million from its contingency reserve funds for this program. Meanwhile, Mr. Reagan has taken $300 million from famine relief funds marked for Ethiopia to use in the region to buy Honduran generals and Salvadorian generals and Costa Rican paramilitary police to create an atmosphere of some sympathy to support our Contra aid program. We're talking about at least $800 million. If you add it all up, it's going to come closer to $1 billion program we've got to do Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the United States has budgeted $1.7 billion to support low-intensity conflicts around the world next year. The big ones: Nicaragua, El Salvador, Angola, Libya and Chad, Ethiopia, Kampuchea, Afghanistan. We have restructured our military. 30,000 troops now in our rapid deployment force to fight small wars in the third world. This is the rationale that's taught in the war colleges that the Congress has approved in restructuring our military. Small wars in the third world, slapping down people who might rise up against our hegemony. We've recently added the 8th Army Special Forces Group, the 7th Army Ranger Battalion, the 4th Psychological Operations Battalion, the JFK Special Warfare Center, and the California Special Training Institute, which is teaching administrators and generals and people in the National Guard and population control techniques in this country. Read Fred Kaplan's article, K&T News from the Boston Globe in July. The activities that we're supporting that we call low-intensity conflict, acts of violence in the third world, domestic turmoil, drug trafficking, political assassination, guerrilla insurgency, revolution, and central war. The tools we use in these things: deception, lying, propaganda, economic sanctions, humanitarian assistance, aid for the local police, military assistance, intelligence gathering, clandestine operations, election rigging, small special forces teams, and large-scale military intervention. But I submit to you that only the terminology and the openness of low-intensity conflict is new. We used to call it covert action. It's been done before. The thing we're doing in Nicaragua today has been done before, once or twice. Like, would you believe, several thousand times? Senator Church, investigating CIA covert action in 1975, told us that what he was finding was that the CIA had been running several hundred covert actions per year. And it's been in business 40 years. And 40 times 300 would be 12,000. So you're talking about several thousand covert actions. CIA apologists leap up and say, yes, but all of these things aren't gory and bloody. And that's true if that's any excuse. You're just bribing a politician to throw his country's vote at the United Nations or something like that. But even that is illegal, and it establishes the question of whether or not the United States has any intention of functioning in a world in which the activities of nations is governed by any kind of rules and understanding. And many of these things are very bloody indeed. And we know about a lot of them, dozens and dozens of them, fully documented in the public record. Testimony from CIA directors, from congressional investigations, from CIA officers writing books, from documents gotten out in the Freedom of Information Act, from accounts written by journalists, from accounts written by victims. And you can read for yourselves, just to go through a few of them. Indonesia, 1965, the CIA set out to discredit the Communist Party by making it appear that the party was going to rise up and kill everybody. Catching arms with documents so that when they were found, it would prove that the Communists were getting ready for a big rebellion to rise up and slaughter people. Paying politicians speeches, articles in newspapers, radio talks to agitate everybody on this subject, on the threat of the Communist Party. Until it flashed, some generals were killed, the army went after the Communists, and there was a bloodbath. The New York Times recorded that they had killed between 500,000 and 1.5 million people. The CIA published 2 reports. One, it leaked to the public through the Library of Congress, titled Indonesia 1965, the coup that backfired. And that was the cover story. Internally, it had another report, which we know about because the CIA case officer Ralph McGehee was custodian of that report, and he wrote his book Deadly Deceits, and he tells us about it. In that report, the CIA said this was a model to be copied elsewhere in the world because it had not only broken eliminated an effective national communist party. It had also eliminated the entire segment of the population that tended to support it, the Indonesian ethnic Chinese, and the CIA report estimated the number of dead at 800,000. And it advocated this to be repeated elsewhere. And that, pure and simply, is genocide. Other classic CIA covert actions that you can go and read about in further detail: Guatemala, Brazil, Guyana, Chile, the Congo, Iran, Panama, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Uruguay. All of these countries, the CIA organized the overthrow of constitutional democracy. Read the book Covert Action, 35 Years of Deception by Darrell Garwood. Remember the Henry Kissinger quote when he was being grilled by Congress after the Chilean operation in which we overthrew the democratically elected President Salvador Allende and killed him and installed the dictator Pinochet to power. He said, "The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." We had a long CIA covert action against China, parachuting teams in just like the Contras. That led us directly into the Korean War, where we fought China and Korea. And we had a long covert action in Vietnam, attacking Ho Chi Minh, who made every effort to be our friend, until eventually we manipulated ourselves into the Vietnam War. Read The Hidden History of the Korean War by I.F. Stone. Read Deadly Deceits by Ralph McGehee. Read Portrait of a Cold Warrior by Joe Smith. In Thailand, Taiwan, Laos, Vietnam, Congo, and Honduras, the CIA put together standing armies. In Vietnam, Congo, Cambodia, Iran, Laos, Nicaragua, and Sri Lanka, the CIA armed and encouraged ethnic minorities to rise up and revolt. In El Salvador, Vietnam, Korea, Iran, Uganda, and the Congo, the CIA created, trained, funded the death squads. The Treasury Police in El Salvador today, the people that haul people out at night and drive trucks over their heads, the people responsible for these 60,000 dead, according to Catholic Church reports. They were formed by the CIA under the Alliance for Progress in the early 60s, and we have testimony before our Congress as late as 1982. Leaders of this unit were still on the CIA payroll. The Public Safety Program. This bears a little bit more mention because there's a message in it that's very important for us to comprehend. This is the one that went on for 26 years with CIA trainers working with Latin American police to teach them in the techniques of torture. You can read about this one, volumes written about it. United Nations hearings, Amnesty International hearings, eventually our own Congress getting into it and having hearings and passing a law and stopping it. There's the film on company business that mentions it, and the film State of Siege that deals with it specifically. Teaching torture, developing special techniques of torture and special gadgets of torture. Dan Mitrione, the advocate that became famous because he was picked up in Uruguay after doing 7 years in Brazil and assassinated. So he got publicity, he was brought back up here and given a hero's burial. Read the book, if you want to get this all into one digestible form, read the book Hidden Terrors by A.J. Langa, professor of journalism at USC. Before that he was a journalist with the New York Times. Mitrione, to teach torture to these classes, would have beggars picked up off the streets. And he would use them as guinea pigs in the torture training classes. But the horror being, of course, that the beggars didn't have any secrets to tell. They couldn't say, "I'm sorry, stop hurting me, here's all the names you want." All they could do is lie there and scream while people practiced the techniques on them. And when they would collapse, doctors would be brought in to shoot them up with vitamin B and rest them up for the next class. And when they would die, their bodies would be mutilated and they'd be dumped back on the streets to strike fear into people's hearts. A woman who was tortured under this program in Brazil for 2 years and then eventually released from the international outcry has testified to these tribunals. She said that the horror went beyond the physical pain and degradation. She said it tied into the fact that the people doing the torture were in fact not raving psychopaths. Had they been, she could have broken mental contact with them. They were very everyday, normal, sane people. She told about one session in which she's in this room, lying on a table, naked, 6 men doing these incredibly painful and degrading things to her body, and there's an interruption. The Americans call to the telephone in the next room, and the rest take a smoke break, and she can hear the conversation, and he's saying, "Oh, hi, honey. Yes, I can wrap this up in another hour or so, and pick up the kids on my way home, and meet you at the ambassador's." Now, the message in all of this is that we teach ourselves in our lore, in our television, in our films, in order to maintain this good guy image that we like to have of ourselves, that hideous things are done to other people by Aryan Gestapo maniacs, or by Slavic KGB monsters, or the latest thing, the missing in action scenario, is where Vietnamese colonels are doing hideous things to helpless prisoners. The truth is, people do hideous things to other people. Red-blooded Americans, as we call ourselves, do hideous things to other people. If the society condones it, if the Congress allocates the money, if the President says it's the right thing to do. Dan Mitrione, stable, devout, Catholic, father of 4, pillar of the community, devoted his life to torturing people because his government said, and thereby by projection his society, that this was a noble thing for him to do with his life. So you look at these things, there's no record kept, but you just start doodling, trying to figure how many people die in these things, these covert actions, now low intensity conflicts for which we're responsible. And I don't mean we're responsible for every war that happens in the world, but the things that we are responsible, that we spent millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to make them happen. How many people die in these things? It's got to be 1 million. 800,000 in Indonesia alone. 4,000 in Nicaragua, 10,000 in the Angolan operation that I was part of. You start multiplying thousands by thousands and you get gross millions. Then you add in the Korean War, which was a spin-off of the propaganda and horror of CIA activities. In the Vietnam War, 2 million people died, which was a spin-off of a long-term CIA operation getting us into war. You're talking about gross millions of people killed by the United States in our national security activities, secret wars and whatnot. So then you say, well, what kind of people? A good Russian is a dead Russian. There are enemies, communists, kill them, great. Except you start looking at these operations and you find that we do not parachute teams into the Soviet Union to mutilate parents while the children are forced to watch, because they have the bomb and a big army, and they would parachute teams right back into the United States. For different reasons, slightly, we don't do these things in England and France and Germany and Sweden and Switzerland and Italy, etc. The common denominator that jumps out at you is that these millions, gross millions of victims are people of the third world whose governments are not strong enough to protect them from our depredations. We're talking about people of the Mitumba Mountains of the Congo, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and now the hills of northern Nicaragua, who have the misfortune of being born in an area that we, the CIA, the United States, chose to target, people who couldn't hurt us if they wanted to, and there's no indication that they wanted to. Those people dying down in northern Nicaragua today, 4,000, 5,000 to date, they're not Russian soldiers, they're not Russian advisors, they're not Cuban soldiers, they're not Cuban advisors, they're not even, by percentage, many Sandinistas. Mostly peasants, mostly women and children. Communists, mostly Catholics. Now, in the question and answer, if you'd like, we can get into a subject I have to skip over now, and that's CIA running domestic operations. This is thoroughly documented as well. It takes a while. I'm going to jump over it. I'm talking about the MK-Ultra program, for example, drug, sex, disease experimentation on American citizens in over 200 medical schools and mental hospitals, experimenting with viruses on people, and those viruses later shown to be closely resembling the AIDS virus, etc., etc., etc. We'll get into that later if you're interested. What we have now is the CIA running 50 destabilizing covert actions, destabilizing 1/3 of the countries in the world, while the United States is gearing for its next war, the Central American War. I've been analyzing this and saying it since 1981 when Al Haig was saying we should put U.S. troops into Nicaragua. He didn't get the support. There wasn't the popular support. The Defense Department wouldn't back him up, so it didn't happen then, as he writes in his memoirs. Now more and more other analysts are coming around to my morbid conclusion, which is that the United States, the present government, the present administration has a policy of trying to get this country into a war to satisfy its political, economic, and psychological needs. Mr. Reagan had said in 1983 he would do whatever is necessary to reverse the situation in Nicaragua. He said we cannot have another Cuba in this hemisphere. He said the Sandinistas are a cancer that has to be cut out. And he said in an August 16 interview with a Mexican newspaper that his objective is to overthrow the Sandinistas. Now, United States public opinion is 70% against his policies down there, but he's proceeding. And this feeling of the American people is encouraging, but it's a tenuous thing. It's what stopped them from doing it so far. But you can't put too much confidence in it. President Eisenhower said, "Indeed, I think that the people of the world genuinely want peace, so much that one of these days governments had better get out of their way and let them have it." But if you've read the United States history, the people almost always wanted peace, and the leaders almost always found a way to get us to go to war. We are, in fact, a very warlike nation. I know we like to talk about peace, but we do war. Once a year, for 200 years now of being a nation, we put our troops into other countries to force them to our will. We fought 15 major wars. We spent 50 years at war. The average amount of time between the end of one war and the beginning of the next one is 10 years. The American people have been taught to hate and fight successively the Seminole Indians, the Cherokee Indians, the Mexico twice, the Plains Indians, the Filipinos, the Spanish and Cubans, the Germans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and now the Nicaraguans. And each war there's been the orchestration of public opinion to support the war effort. In each war there have been eventually triggers that galvanize the national interest so we would go plunging in. It's very hard for you to see this while you're living it. People are saying, nah, there's no way we're going to go. Important people, bright people, Colonel Buck Buchanan at the CDI in Washington, analyzing Nicaragua and saying, they've got the plans there, but they'll never be able to do it. The politics, they just can't sell it in this environment. But 15 presidents before have, in fact, sold the nation on wars. And there's no reason. Read Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. It goes back and treats every one of these wars, giving the quotes of the leaders where they said, for example, in the Mexican War, they wanted to go down there and fight. Why? I'll tell you in a minute. They offered $2 a head, bill through Congress, for every man who would go down, to go down and fight. Wasn't enough. So they offered 100 acres for everybody who would go and fight and come back. And they got a few takers, but it wasn't enough. So they sent General Taylor down, patrol up and down the other side of the internationally recognized border until the Mexicans fired on them, a provocation. And the Mexicans fired on them. And then the headlines read, Mexicans killing our boys in Texas. And the nation rose up, and we went down and fought. And we annexed Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, part of Colorado, and the state of California. Triggers: the battleship Maine, Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, the Bay of Tonkin, just to cite a few, each one dramatic events that galvanize the American opinion to get us to go down and fight. Once again, you can read for yourselves. In each war, people have resisted. 30,000 people jailed during the Civil War for protesting the war. 6,000 people jailed during World War I for protesting the war. Kate Richards O'Hare said, in 1915, the women of the United States are nothing but brood sows producing sons to be put in the army to be made into fertilizer. And she was jailed for 5 years for anti-war talk. So we look around our society today. It's been 21 years since the Bay of Tonkin, 13 years since we got our troops out of Vietnam. We're overdue. The bicycle wheel has gone around, the valve stem's coming back down to the ground, so you say, is this nation getting itself ready for war? One could conclude that we likely would be because of the cycle, and it's come back again. And so what you see when you start looking for it is militarization of the society at every level. Glorification of war. Olive drab, camouflage chic. In the airports, you'll see kids nowadays with olive drab diaper covers. In a bike store the other day, I saw camouflage bicycles with camouflage helmets being sold to kids. Glorification of war everywhere, beginning with the president. We begin our war conditioning at the age of 2, when we put our kids in front of the one-eyed babysitter and hit the button and turn it on. And they watch episode after episode every day of Sheena and He-Man and the Thundercats and the Transformers and the Decepticons. And now there's a Rambo series. And every one of these nice little people being attacked by evil forces until they rise up, and put them off at the last minute. It's estimated that by the time one of us graduates from high school, we've seen more violence, more hours of violence on television than we spent sitting in classrooms. Propagandistic about it. You have a force of Russians, Cubans, and Nicaraguans have invaded the United States. And they get all the way to Colorado, where they're finally stopped by the high school football team. Most of the football players would get draft deferments because they could show they had a pinched nerve or chipped something or other, and therefore they couldn't qualify to go out and get killed in a real war situation. The Grenada invasion, America feeling great again, a fraud, a scam. Nothing great about this country stomping on a little bitty country that's 8 miles by 16 miles with 80,000 people with 2 poorly armed rifle company units. If you want to talk about Grenada in the question and answer, I'll be happy to. The bombing of Libya, stirring all of the primeval emotions in Americans' breasts on the basis last spring of the terrorist scam. I presume everybody in this room would be perceptive enough to understand and to have seen immediately through the terrorist scam and what the bombing of Libya was all about. If not, bring it up in the question and answer and we'll talk about it a little bit. Rewriting the history of the Vietnam War so that kids coming out of high school are taught that our cause was just. Some people in the States didn't understand, so Henry Kissinger, to keep the peace, he engineered an honorable withdrawal and got us out. Nothing to do with what really happened, but see, we don't teach our own children. They're taught in the schools, and they're being taught that our cause was just in Vietnam and that we should have seen it through. And rewriting the legal codes of the United States seriously to curtail the freedoms of press and assembly and such that I fought wars for, to defend, that we've been taught, made our country unique. That, too, takes a little bit to get through it. If you want to ask about it later, I'll just point out what I'm sure you're all up on. Ed Meese, Californian, Mr. Reagan's closest friend. He made him Attorney General. This man is now touring the country saying the Constitution never did guarantee freedom of speech and press and assembly. He says that's a myth. All of this that's happening now, it's happened before in our history, but what's happening right now is made possible because of Mr. Reagan. Political phenomenon, charming, handsome, charismatic, especially popular with young men. Young men, 18 to 24, that draft age, traditional age of cannon fodder, voted for this man in greater percentages than anyone else in the society. Now there's an irony in that we should take note of, because in fact Mr. Reagan has a documented record of not being sympathetic to young men. But we're not a rational people. We don't read, we don't think, we don't advise ourselves. We let our adrenaline and we respond. And generation after generation, goes marching off to war. A rational person who's being asked to go off somewhere and die or kill people would think a little bit. Who's asking me? What kind of people are they? Read a book. Inform yourselves. Mr. Reagan, to note the obvious, has a history of glamorizing war. He claims he's seen 4 wars, but he saw those 4 wars from Hollywood, where he was the handsome captain. You go over Germany and 800 Germans fall down dead, and they shoot back, but they can't hit you because they're too stupid, and you come back and you get medals, or you're killed, but it's a hero's death, and the goosebumps up and down your spine, and then you take a shower and wash off the ketchup, and you go out to dinner, and you do it again. And this old man's memories of war. Terribly dangerous thing, because the wars that I've seen where the bodies were on the ground just weren't that way at all, not at all. And we've got a few others going around the country of the same ilk. Gordon Liddy, touring the country, saying to the young people, and he's very articulate. He gets them, pep rally, 1,000, cheering and whistling. And he's saying, your uncles and your fathers didn't understand. They didn't understand in the Vietnam War. You understand. We have to fight communists. We have to go and stand up to these people. The Soviet Union understands that the KGB has a role to play in society. This country doesn't understand that we need, some kind of a police discipline and action and whatnot and whatnot. And people, yeah, cheering and yelling. So you ask yourselves, if we were rational in his audience, where was Mr. Liddy when this country was fighting communists and he was young enough to volunteer and go fight communists? The answer is he was hiding out in this country running sloppy, unprofessional, illegal, breaking and entering operations for a sleazy politician. If you'll forgive me a bit of egoism, at that same time, I was running professional breaking and entering operations. And then you have Rambo himself, Sylvester Stallone, making these fabulous movies where he goes to Vietnam, and 600 Vietnamese fall down dead and they shoot back, but they can't hit him because they're too stupid, to shoot straight. And he kills them all and saves everybody and gets out and everything. Wow. If you talk to veterans who were there, they tell you the Vietnamese shot back real well. That pound for man for man, not pound for pound, man for man, the 135-pound Vietnamese soldier was a better soldier in the jungle than our 200-pound Marine. He could walk further, eat less, and fight harder. That's the truth. But this fantasy Mr. Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, is playing, where was he in the Vietnam War where he could have done these things for real? The truth is, he got a draft deferment for a physical disability, and he spent the war in Switzerland teaching physical education in a girls' school. Getting back to the problem, Mr. Reagan, I submit to you that he's the most dangerous man in the history of the United States. I suggest that he has, in fact, a defective mind. Now, I don't mean to take cheap shots. To note the obvious, he is one hell of a politician. Greatest politician in the history of the country, perhaps, which is a tribute to the irrationality of the political process. But I don't mean to take cheap shots. I'm going to try to show you very quickly what I mean. He did, in fact, say you could always call back the cruise missiles. Now, we don't want to take his statements out of context and be unfair. He said B-52s, cruisers, and submarines, you can always call them back. You can call back a B-52. You can call back a submarine. The cruise missile is programmed to read the terrain as it goes in at treetop level. It's not programmed to read the reverse terrain and come back out. It does not have landing gear. When it lands, it goes boom. I wouldn't want to call one back. Helen Caldecott, in her last book, she titled Missile Envy. She records a conversation with Mr. Reagan. His daughter heard her speak and said, "You got to talk to the old man," and set it up, and Helen talked to him in the Oval Office. And she records the conversation. 9 things, he said, indicating he simply does not understand about missiles and bombs and things. At one point she said, Mr. Reagan, that's right out of Reader's Digest. And he said, no, that's classified Defense Department stuff. And his daughter said, Father, that's out of Reader's Digest. He gave a talk to a group of veterans in New York City, and he told this delightful story of a bomber that was shot down over Germany in World War II. One of the crew members was injured, wounded. He couldn't jump out. The others decided not to leave their buddy, so they all went in together and crashed, and they were all killed. Now, these were veterans, including pilots, and they said afterwards, wait a minute, if the plane crashed and they were all killed, how do we know all these details about what happened? So they researched it, and there was no record of any such thing happening in World War II in Germany, but it was the plot of a movie that Mr. Reagan had been part of at that time. And then it starts to get serious. To give you a couple of things that you would be well aware of, being here in California, his famous bloodbath quote in 1970, when he was asked about the violence, the demonstrations on campuses protesting the Vietnam War, and he said, if there has to be a bloodbath, let's get it over with. And then to make sure that he had not been misunderstood because there was an outcry, he said it again 3 days later. If there has to be a bloodbath, he was not talking about a bloodbath of Vietnamese, getting that over with. He was talking about a bloodbath of our own young people in our own country, in our own campuses. And he was not bluffing. He did call out the National Guard, and they did shoot people. And then there's his botulism quote, when he was asked about his reaction to the Symbionese Liberation Army's demand that $5 million in food be given to the poor as a ransom for Petty Hearst's release. And he said, it's too bad we can't arrange a plague of botulism. Now the press went to see his speechwriter to ask if that had been in his notes or if he'd made it up on the spot, and his ex-former speechwriter said no sane man could utter those words. But he did, Mr. Reagan. This is the man that calls the MX the peacemaker. This is the man who's told us that nuclear war is winnable. This is the man who calls the Contras, likens them to our founding fathers. This is the man who says that South Africa is making great progress towards racial equality. This is the man that says we're going to put this shield up in space and missiles will bounce off of it and we won't have to worry anymore. This is the man who says that you can increase spending enormously without increasing taxes and the deficit will magically disappear. This is the man who went to Iceland recently and in the course of the conversation stuck out his hand to Mr. Gorbachev and said, well, if that's what you want, let's do it, meaning getting rid of all missiles and everything just like that. While one may say that's a great thing, the fact is he had not even conferred with his aides and assistants in figuring out how to do it. And then afterwards, of course, he lied and retracted it. The man's mind literally does not hit on all cylinders. Read for yourselves. Read the Book of Quotes, McGraw-Hill, 1979. Read There He Goes Again, Reagan's Reign of Error. Read On Reagan, The Man in the Presidency by Ronnie Duggar. Read the Village Voice article 2 years ago. Mr. Reagan has a historic fixation on Armageddon. Over 9 times in public he's talked about the fact that we are now living out Armageddon. We're all playing our roles in Armageddon. The difference, of course, is that he's the one with the finger on the button that can make it all happen. What makes him so ultimately dangerous is the fact that he is so superficial and also he does not identify with young people. I have a young son. We live with my parents. My father is Mr. Reagan's age. He knows he's not going to be around this planet too much longer. He takes the boy for walks and plays checkers and dominoes with him and reads stories to him because the boy is the continuation of life. Mr. Reagan has a young grandson that he has never seen, held, hugged, bounced on his knee. Last spring they made a big deal in the press when Mr. Reagan went to see his grown son dance, the professional dancer dance, for the first time ever. Where was Daddy for 22 years when this boy was growing up, doing all of his rehearsals and programs and becoming a pro and all of that? The answer is Daddy could care less. until the boy was a man performing as a man in an adult world. Mr. Reagan does not identify with young people. He talks about the fact that we are all living out our roles as we go to Armageddon. As he fails, as his joints creak, as it's all coming to an end for him, he fantasizes that we're all going out together. This is what I mean when I say this is the most dangerous man in the history of the world. He functions to appeal to Americans' irrationality. You don't have to worry about nuclear war. You don't have to worry about the environment. If you've seen one redwood tree, you've seen them all, and it's not going to be here in 20 years anyway, so chop them down and use them up, and don't worry about it because we're living out Armageddon. And the point is he is appealing to people not to think and not to be responsible, and that's a great relief to him, and that's why they cling to him with such a passion, and that's what makes him so dangerous. You've got to be screaming, why? Why do we do these things? Why do we have the system that we do? Before Mr. Reagan got into office, and if we survive him afterwards, why do we go to war every 10 years? Why has the CIA been permitted to run 10,000 brutal covert actions? Why do we destabilize a third of the countries in the world today? Why are our leaders taking us into another war? Why are we systematically taught to hate and fight anybody? The answers lie in aggression and economics. Macho, aggression, paranoia. These are, the adrenaline factor, the football pep rally factor. These are the easiest ways, the easiest buttons to reach in the human breast to push, to get people rah, 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 charge, kill, follow me into combat. And there's lots more money to be made through war and the machinery of war than there is through peace. The profits and political gain from military production and spending are enormous, as you well know. The CDI says we're spending 61 cents of every tax dollar on the military. The Washington Post puts the figure at 53 cents. That's still over half of our taxes are going to this giant military burden we're carrying. We're in the process under Mr. Reagan in this 6-year period of time of spending $2.25 trillion on arms. $435 billion of that is to build and deploy 17,000 more nuclear weapons. The military rip-offs, of course, are classic and enormous. I'm talking about $300 for a hammer, $700 for a toilet seat that should cost $18, $7,600 for a coffee pot, $1,043 for a little steel bolt that you can buy for 25 cents in a hardware store. And God knows how much money for the reinforced concrete, silos in which they put MXs and midget men and Minutemen and whatnot. The military-industrial complex makes 35% profit. The average norm for society and free industry is less than a third of that. And this is why they're clinging to that. This is why they set up a system. The profits are so gigantic. They don't want to build universities and schools and streets and hospitals because you only make a finite amount of profit on that. But by scaring the American people, by destabilizing the world, having the CIA out there killing millions of people, by creating a hostile world that has good reason to hate our guts, and then showing the American people the proof of the hostility and wars being fought everywhere, then we will let them spend any amount of money on arms. And that's how the system works. Nicaragua is only the current designated enemy. We've attacked Cuba, we've attacked Vietnam, we've attacked the Congo, we've attacked Angola, designating enemies regularly in order to work the people up and focus our paranoia, so we give them a blank check to spend these enormous amounts of money on arms. Now, the conservative argument is that this has worked for 200 years to make this the greatest country in the history of the world, so why change it? This argument goes that, life started on the veldt in Africa with the strong eating the weak, that every form of life has to eat another form of life to survive. That's a fact. It may be a little bit harsh, but if people have to die by the thousands in Chile or Nicaragua for us to be strong and safe up here, that's the way it is, and tough shit, and so be it. But even if you're harsh enough that you don't care about the morality of that argument, you still got a problem. This arms race, the destabilization of the world, still won't work to your own safety and security. The economics of this thing, it's breaking the United States. We have giant budgetary and trade deficits. The United States is a debtor nation now internationally for the first time since World War I, and our own internal debt is now staggering proportions. It's gone from $900 billion to $2.4 trillion under Mr. Reagan in the last 6 years alone. The capital and technology that are absorbed into the military are not spent building trade goods. So we are no longer competitive with Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the European countries. Read The Overburdened Economy by Lloyd Dumas, put out this last summer. He estimates that if we reversed the arms race right now, we might not be able to recover our economic supremacy in the world. And since we're not reversing it, we are certainly on a decline. And the question, as he puts it, is it a slow decline or a sudden collapse that we're facing because of this giant burden we're carrying? The other reason why we can't cling to the rationales that we used in the Mexican War and the Seminole Indian War and whatnot is these nuclear weapons, the nuclear state of the world, the 52,000, soon to be 70,000 bombs, a world where we have cruise missiles and Pershing IIs in Europe that can hit Russia in 7 minutes' time. So the Russians will have 4 minutes warning when they see missiles coming on their radar screens, in which to call us and say, is this a mistake, or should we launch all of our missiles? We used to be told not to worry about these things because they were fail-safe. But they don't talk about this very much anymore. Just think a minute. Last year alone, the Challenger 2 blew up, a Delta rocket, 2 Titans, a French Ariane, the Chernobyl plant, and the Soviet SS-18. And it wasn't a bad year. The year before that, there were 2 $85 million satellites went tumbling in space. A $65 million launch had to be destroyed as it took off from Cape Canaveral. Soviet cruise missile went tooling over Norway. The Pershing II blew up on its pad in Germany. Texas Instruments was found to be selling faulty chips to the 80 defense contractors. Bombs have fallen out of planes 5 times at least. 1 over Spain, 1 off the coast of Portugal, 2 in the Carolinas, 1 in Nevada. 1 of those in the Carolinas, 5 of the 6 safety devices blew. 1 more and we would have had a bomb right there. The other one in the Carolinas they never found. It landed in the swamp, so they bought the land and fenced it off and called it a nuclear-free zone or nuclear-restricted area until today. Submarines, 5 submarines have disappeared into the ocean. And when they go down, 1 of them just last month, and when they go down in deep water, they implode. So we have those dozens of nuclear weapons floating around on the bottom of the ocean now, rusting. If that's where they are, because some of these, there was no record. They didn't report in. Suddenly, boom, they're gone. So we have to presume they're down there as opposed to someone capturing them and stealing them. What's at stake with all of this is the fate of the earth. What's at stake is your lives and mine, our children. For the young people, the right, the opportunity to grow a little older and have children of your own, and those children have a world to grow up in. What's at stake, of course, is the unborn generations of the human race that may never have a chance to be because of our foolishness. You have to be saying, what can we do? If we're up against the military-industrial complex of the United States and England and France and Germany and Russia and the whole world, what can we do? And the answer is it's a tough one. Without any question, it's the greatest challenge that's ever faced the human race. But we have to try because of what's at stake. So you look around for glimmers of hope. Has anything ever been done that would equate, that we could seize upon? And you find them. A war was fought, and slavery was abolished in this country. And then 100-year civil rights struggle until we got the country to a point where the KKK could not lynch people with impunity. And then there are less gory examples. The women's movement. 80 years ago only, a man could put his wife and sisters and daughters to work in factories, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and he could pocket their salaries saying only the man is wise enough to know how to spend the money. And that's been changed a little bit. Not by any gift from on high, but by the determined efforts of feminist activists for 8 decades. And here's the catch, here's the ringer, here's what's so exciting about that, is it was a peaceful struggle. They didn't kill anybody. And then you have a young professor, Jerry Bender, at UC San Diego, who stopped my war in Angola. He was lecturing, he was trying to organize, nothing was happening. So he called up Senator Tunney one day, and he said, Mr. Tunney, I think something dangerous is being done in Angola. I think you're being lied to. I happen to have gotten my thesis in Angola. I think I can straighten it out for you. I want the opportunity to brief you. Mr. Tunney agreed. Jerry briefed him rationally, soberly. Tunney went back and examined what he had said, and he introduced the FY 76 amendment to the Defense Appropriation Bill and stopped my war in Angola, just like that. Helen Caldecott, at the end of her lectures, I've heard her say, get out and get to work on this problem. You'll feel better if you get to work on it, as opposed to sitting back at home with a knot in your stomach wondering when the bombs and missiles are going to land on your place, or when we're going to invade Nicaragua. And she says, if you do get out and get to work on it, then when the bombs start going off, if there's a few minutes time before the one lands on your town, at least you'll have the right to turn to your loved ones and say, honey, at least we tried. Now, old Admiral LaRocque up there in Washington, Center for Defense Information, I went to ask him because, where do I know? And I said, Admiral, people ask me, what can I do? This old man, bright, about stuff. And, he said, I love that question. I tell him, I don't know you as individuals. I can't tell you what to do. You know yourself. You do what you're comfortable with. If you can write letters, write telegrams, write articles, write books. If you can travel, go and see for yourself in Nicaragua or elsewhere. If you can organize, organize. He said, if you feel comfortable sitting down in front of trucks with bombs on them, sit down in front of trucks with bombs on them. But he said, you've got to do what you feel comfortable doing every day of your life. Beginning today, you can't wait until December when this happens, or next spring when you graduate, or next fall when you're divorced, or whatever, because those missiles could be on their way right now tonight, or tomorrow, or next week. There may not be a world here by the time you graduate or get promoted or whatever next year. Thank you very much for hearing me out. Thank you. The thought was, it usually is, that we could do discussion, debate, comments, whatever, afterwards, and there's certainly plenty of time for a while anyway, so why don't we make it into a forum? Yes, sir. I love that question. He said, I'm saying these things and he admires it. Don't I ever worry that the CIA might not be so enthusiastic about what I'm doing? Am I scared? I feel, it comes up all the time, I feel like, the uncle who's got heart disease. And at every family get-together, people come up and say, aren't you worried, about your heart? And he's sitting there every living moment. He's thinking about his tickers about to blow on him. And of course, if I come here and tell you the documentation right in our own record of how they've killed millions of people, I have to be aware of the jeopardy in what I do, yes. However, let me point out that if they run my car off the road, I'm just going to get there a little bit before you will. If we don't stand up and make a dramatic change, there's not very many people in this room who are going to die of old age. Or to put it another way, each of you go home tonight and get out your dictionary and get a good hard eraser and erase safe and secure. Just take it out of the dictionary. So there's nobody in this world with 52,000, soon to be 70,000 nuclear weapons that is in any way safe. My biggest concern, if y'all will forgive me, this is a little bit crass, but my biggest concern is when they get me and how it happens or whatever, and there are lots of others speaking out, and I'm just another one and trying to do the best I can. My biggest problem is economic survival. I gave up my paycheck. I didn't get fired and I didn't retire. I quit to go public. And we have successively lost house, car, savings, moved in with my parents, and then for the last 4 years, we go down about $10,000 a year from what we can make lecturing and the cost of running this whole thing. And I'm faced with the very real prospect of being put out of business just by go to work in an automobile store or something. And I think this would be regrettable, especially right now, with the war in the offing in Central America and the nuclear arms race with the threat that it is. And the only way I can think of, I've been to every center in this nation, every peace fund, and there's none of them going to touch an ex-CIA colonel. They love me, they'll take me to lunch, and that's the size of it. I don't blame them, I understand the reality. All these universities, they get money from the Defense Department, so they're not going to put me on as a lecturer, although I might be able to teach an interesting course in government. What I'm trying to do is, people have encouraged me as I'm trying to set up, God knows we don't need another center or fund or foundation of any kind, but I am trying to set up a small nonprofit office that would, one, make it possible for me to bridge this $10,000 a year. It's not a lot of money. It's about what a secretary makes our first year, in fact, less than a first-year school teacher makes in Texas. If we can raise that, if we could get 1,000 people around the nation, each putting in $10 or $20 a year, it would make the difference to keep us functional. And I'm trying to put together this office. It would do things like supporting my lectures. I organize big bike rides in the summer to protest the nuclear arms race. I take people down to Nicaragua. I organize rallies and participate in panels and lecture all the time. And so if you have any feelings about this and you would like to join this little thing and support it, write me and let's do it. Yes, sir. Yes. The question is, would I say how my book was censored by the CIA? When I wrote the book, there was no law against such books. Now it would be illegal. Mr. Reagan, getting the government off the people's back, has passed laws making such books a felony now. They didn't have any laws to punish me with, so they sued at the same time Frank Snep's book came out, and his book was 2 months ahead of mine, so they sued him, and they didn't accuse him of revealing secrets. They just said that if you've worked for the government, you have a fiduciary responsibility not to attack the government. And they accused him of writing an unauthorized account of the Vietnam War. And that sounds to me a little bit like a fascist policy or a communist or Russian an unauthorized account as opposed to authorized account. And they took $200,000 away from him. And because he had a film thing he'd signed as well. In my case, by the time they sued me, I'd spent all the money. The book made about 80 some odd thousand. Actually, it's more than that now, including what they've stolen. But I hadn't signed a film contract yet, so they couldn't get into that. And so it was a little bit less than Mr. Snep's what they actually, but I'd spent the money. 4 years go by, 80,000 with your overhead and everything, it's 10,000 a year left over. So there wasn't anything. So I thwarted them by filing for bankruptcy. And it actually got to be kind of funny. I tried to get some support to fight them, but there was just no support anywhere because the Supreme Court had just ruled on the Snep case. So you couldn't get any ACLU money to fight a hot, with the same Supreme Court. And so, then my purpose became survival. And that's where it got to be funny because they sue you in Washington. You have to fly up to Washington and pay, give up your life, your family, your car, pay a hotel, and for 2 years, 3 years, while they jerk you around in a lawsuit, taxis and all of that, and who can afford that? And they just break you with that, and they're very conscious of this, and they think it's funny. But six of the Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, 6 of the government attorneys signed the papers against me, including, like I say, the Deputy Assistant. So I filed for bankruptcy down in Texas. Now, in a bankruptcy litigation, all outstanding lawsuits come under the bankruptcy, which means that they would have to come down to Austin, which meant that all of a sudden they weren't pulling my chain, I was pulling theirs. So they have to come down to Austin and check into a hotel and be away from their families, while I stall and delay and balk and take, we'd like 2 months to research this, Your Honor. And they're having to show their auditors why it should be done to come down to Texas and live in hotels and charge their $100 a day per diem for their whole legal staff, suing someone who doesn't have any money, who's bankrupt. And so all of a sudden, like I say, it became quite comical. They were sort of backing and filling. And they indicated to my attorneys, who were not very good, I must say, I loved them, they were ACLU, but they certainly were not very dynamic, but nevertheless, God, that one, he'd lived too long working with the ACLU, and he would go to meetings, he'd come back and spend the first 15 minutes of briefing me, telling me what, he said, well, they're really wonderful people. You've got to understand, I just had lunch with them, they're really nice people. And, I thought they fucked pigs. I mean, they were trying to take away my life, and I'd lived with them for a while. But anyway, what they said was that if he's really broke, we won't pursue this thing. But they were afraid that they might drop the case, and then I might sign $1 million movie deal and make them look silly. So they attached all future profits. By that time the book had peaked out. It was no longer a bestseller, although it had been. It had peaked out, so they insisted, and they assured us they would come down to Texas at least long enough to get a court order that everything that I earned on that book for the rest of my life would go to the CIA. So to get the thing away and get on with my life and write another book, I agreed to that. They also put me under a court order that anything I write for the rest of my life will be submitted for censorship, with or penalty of going to jail without trial. The title of the book was In Search of Enemies, Norton, 78. This is the United States of America. And by that, in addition to it, they passed laws since then so that now it wouldn't be a civil suit, it would be a felony. One of them, the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, 1982, President Reagan signed it into law. No, it would be a felony now. Yes? Hear that? It's a more complicated thing because it wasn't really a question, although there were question marks at the end, but he's saying that I had said this, that, and the other about the military-industrial complex and everything, but I had not touched on how we're going to make a change of all this, and more radical, as he put it, philosophy. Are we going to have to fight to change it? I.e., we're going to have a revolution in this country to tear apart the system, to wrench power out of the hands, now I'm going beyond what he said, of the military-industrial complex. I have some real problems with that. If we're teetering on the brink of exterminating ourselves because of our propensity to war, and we set out to change it by doing another bloody war, there's a catch-22. We won't have changed anything. And I guess that summarizes the way I feel about it. I don't have any brilliant answer, and I'm pretty cynical about our chances for changing the thing. I do not see, I've gotten in a big argument with, I wouldn't argue with him, he's too smart, Carl Sagan. But at a lecture in Ithaca to tease Margaret Redmond Gibson, the wife of Bill Gibson, the playwright and big activist herself, a psychology professor herself at Harvard, and she'd come down to this lecture, and she wants us to be cheerful and optimistic about all of this, and so someone asked me to put a statistic on our survival chances of, so because I knew, because she and I talked about it in the car all day, I said about 1,000,001, 1,000,000 to 1 against us making it, or another 20 or 30 years, and she was scowling at me and everything. And Carl Sagan's, one of his cohorts, a young PhD, came running up afterwards and he said, Stockwell, you're right on, everything you're saying. But he said, it's not 1,000,001 odds. He said, Carl and I have talked about this a lot. He said, it would be more like 100 to 1. And I said, thanks a lot. You know, I was just popping something off the top of my head. And if you've really thought about it, you know, I like my 1,000,000 to 1 better than I do your 100 to 1. But I really mean that. We got a big problem. The human, I say human beast sometimes. People jump up and say, beasts don't do these things to each other. The human race, our history is a history of war. This problem, this Gordon Liddy factor, it goes back to the caveman days. The hairiest chested, ugh, we go kill them before they kill us. The testosterone factor, the male hormone, go and kill. And it's been throughout history. There have been peaceful people, but they didn't dominate the scene. Maybe they, lived their lives and died, but history has also been war after war after war, bigger nations fighting bigger wars, now with the propensity to do ourselves in, and we have not changed this propensity to violence one bit. The world has more wars being fought now than it ever has. And the United States an open policy of war and whatnot. And it's a catch-22. If we go out to solve this by effecting a war in the United States, in which, God knows, there would be lots of people killed and repressed and all of that, I fail to see how we would really have advanced the human race's chance for survival. Yes, sir. Let me take your question. This gentleman has asked about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I mentioned to you earlier that the Reagan administration is rewriting the laws of the land. They call it the Reagan Revolution. I'm not projecting what they would like to do in my own paranoid thought or perspective of them. This is stuff they have done, or they're in the process of doing, which they have told us is their revolution to have permanent changes in the way our country operates. You have the Victor Marchetti ruling of the Supreme Court in 1974, giving the government the right to pre-publication censorship of books. Frank Snepp ruling of the Supreme Court gave them the right to seize profits from books. The Phil Agee passport ruling, this is the Iron Curtain Free Society, that gave the Secretary of State the right to take away your passport without a hearing. They don't have to accuse you of nothing. They come and get your passport and you don't travel, except when they agree you can travel. Mr. Reagan came into office and restored the CI to full historical function and commissioned it to operate domestically against American citizens and American citizens groups. The Intelligence Identities Protection Act in 1982 made it a felony to publish about the activities of secret agents, their names or their activities that would draw attention to them. Now, what does this mean, the debate about this thing? If you, for example, found Agent Smith and Jones in your community here experimenting on you, your family, your loved ones with LSD or disease, it would be a felony for you to write articles in your local paper saying, watch out for these two turkeys, Smith and Jones, they're experimenting on us with disease. Now, in that MKUltra thing that went on for 20 years in 200 medical schools and mental hospitals, when it was closed down, when the Congress got into it and there was an outcry and it was closed down, not one person was punished. Not one person went to jail. Not one person lost a single paycheck for having experimented on American citizens with disease and drugs. Now, if you had, for example, CSPIS organization here, just to pick one, and you found that in your midst, your Vice Chairman Smith was a federal agent and was advocating that you go blow up the federal building. This is a technique that they used in the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War days. You penetrate a group, you get the group to go blow something up, then they become an illegal organization and the society turns against them. And you can go against them openly, more powerfully. Now, you would not be permitted to publish in your own internal CSPIS bulletin an article saying Vice Chairman Smith, who is advocating blowing up the federal building, is a federal agent trying to discredit us. Like I say, not Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. These are laws that they have passed in this country today. Mr. Reagan's efforts, which he has not succeeded yet, but he still pursues the policy of muzzling government employees. Anybody who's ever worked for the government would have to submit anything they wrote the rest of their lives to 6 offices of censorship. And his other one was that everybody who worked for the government would have to submit to a lie detector test. And that one crashed when Mr. Schultz said, "Not me. The day comes they don't trust me, I'll quit." And I'm sure, people below his rank might feel the same way. And it might be downright ludicrous if somebody was to put Mr. Reagan on. Why do you take it to us? The Grenada operation, exclusion of the press from Grenada, putting out over national television what the Army Psy-War office had filmed of what was happening in Grenada. And they did not film the truth. The Seidel Commission after Grenada agreeing that in the next invasion there would be a press pool. The New York Times, everybody would put up reps who would go in with the landing force and would publish through the landing force commanders, telegraph offices, accounts that were censored, but accounts of the landing force of what was happening. The preemptive strikes bill. Secretary Schultz submitted this in 1984. He did not succeed in selling it. They haven't retracted it. They've submitted it in different forms, getting congressmen and senators to submit it since then. This is the one where he said that terrorism is such a threat that we have to have special laws to cope with it, that we have to be able to go in and strike preemptively against people who are preparing to strike, i.e., as they say, if you know somebody's about to bomb our embassy, you ought to be able to go in and hit them first. But we don't need a law to do that. We do it anyway. We invaded Grenada and we bombed Libya and we blew up people in the Middle East. But you see, this bill that he submitted would make this legal in the United States as well. And in his defense of it, he said that the Secretary of State should have the authority to put together a list of known terrorists, suspected terrorists, and terrorist sympathizers. And if your name is on the list, you would not be permitted to go to court to sue to have your name taken off the list. Now, and if your name's on the list, they could kick in your door and kill you with impunity. Now, the New York Times was screaming that this was, and everybody else in the nation just about, that this was no different from Hitler's night in fog program, hauling people away into the night in fog. But Secretary Schultz didn't withdraw it. He's still pressing for it in different forms. On October the 26th, 1984, giving a speech in New York,